learners, welcome to another session in counseling psychology. In this session, we are going to talk about a very important therapy which is known as behavioral therapy. We will cover this behavioral therapy into two different parts. In the very first part, we will talk about what behavioral therapy is all about, their foundations, their goals, their assumptions, and how the behavioral therapist deal with the client, and their relationship with the client will discuss in this session. So, in this session we are going to talk about behavioral therapy in the different context in terms of their goal and all. So, when we talk about the behavioral therapy, its popularity gained in the 1950 onwards when the two school of thoughts emerges or we can say the two different school of thoughts like behavioral and cognitive approaches emerges in 1950 onwards. Early to 1950, there was a one popular therapy which was dominated across the globe was psychoanalysis. So, in contrast to the psychoanalysis, the behavioral approaches came into existence, and these behavioral and cognitive approaches basically differ from the psychoanalysis in the two ways. The first, they emphasized on the client action as opposed to the client passively waiting for insight. As we can see in the psychoanalytical approach, the client is very passive on that particular stage, but in the behavioral therapy we will see that how the client is in very action positions, or which is opposed to the client passively waiting for the insight. And another key differences that we can address here, which is the belief of the locus of trouble to lie in the present as opposed to the past and childhood. As we can see that the psychoanalytical approach mostly the focus was on the past or childhood, where in the behavioral therapy the counselor focus upon the present behavior of the person and they identify the reason behind that behavior in the present only. So, before going into detail about behavioral therapy, let me talk about how the behaviorist or behavioral approaches think about human nature, because ultimately the behavioral therapy would develop on the basis of what understanding is all about, how they see the human nature in their own way. So, the behavioral therapist or behavioral approaches basically think about human nature differently from the psychoanalytical approaches. They actually concentrate on the behavioral process. That is the process closely related with the overt behavior, which we can observe directly, we can also measure directly, and which are mostly overt in nature. So, the behavioral approaches focuses on here and now approach. It is opposed to the then and there behavior. So, the behavioral approaches focus upon here and now approach rather than to be then and there in the past and other things. So, they mostly focus upon the present things. And behavioral approach also has an assumption that the behavior is learned, whether it is adaptive or maladaptive. In both the cases, the behaviorist or behavioral approaches think about human behavior is all about outcome of learning. So, what we learn, if behavior is maladaptive or adaptive, in both cases behavior is a outcome of learning, it is learned totally. So, the behavioral approaches also believe that the learning can be effectively used in changing maladaptive behavior. So, if you want to change your behavior, the learning can be one of the important ingredient or a way through which we can change the maladaptive behavior, which is we do not want to sustain in our life or in our day to day activity. So, on that particular case we can understand the behavioral approaches basically think about learning is one of the mean which is very effective in order to change the maladaptive behavior or the behavior which we do not like in our life. So, behavioral approaches also focuses upon the setting up well defined therapy goal with the client. They discuss with the client and well define what would be the goal of the therapy and what they have to achieve in their whole sessions. And behavioral approaches also think about rejection of idea that the human personality is made up of traits. So, they believe that the behavior is nothing but is an outcome of learning. It is not made up with the traits that we generally see in the other therapeutic approach. So, before going into technical part or the major things related with the behavioral therapy, let me talk about some basic background or the history of emergence of behavioral therapy. So, this emergence can be addressed easily with the help of different contribution. The first contribution comes with the J.B. Watson in 1913, stated that only observable behavior can be empirical roots that will be sustained for the field of psychology in human future, and that the J.B. Watson contribution, or we can say the J.B. Watson stated that only observable behavior can be the empirical roots that will sustain for the field of psychology in the nature in the future, and we can only observe those behavior which are observable in nature. We can empirically measure those things. In 1950 to 1960 are being to develop a therapeutic approach based on the theories of learning. So, here we can see that 1950 and 1960 are the beginning of the development of therapeutic approach based on the theories of learning, which has been given by Pavlov and Skinner in the meanwhile. So, these approaches is emerged in the United States and South Africa, as well as Great Britain is also one of the places where this therapy actually emerged. So, basically their focus was on the changing of behavior of individual experiencing psychological distress to help them with the cope better. How they can cope better, it is a major focus of attention of the behavioral therapist, or we can say the behavioral approach basically focus upon the changing of behavior of the individual, what they experience due to psychological distress, and how they can cope up with them, and how they can make their life better. So, like phobia, bedwetting, tension related disorder were actually being tackled by using insight from the Pavlov classical conditioning, which you might be aware about these things. Pavlov classical conditioning is also very associative learning theory, which are very popular on that particular point of time, and in these days we also refer these theories in the different contexts. In Africa, we see that Wolf and Lazarus in 1966 were developing actually the technique of systematic desensitization. We will talk more about the systematic desensitization in upcoming session. Here you can see how these people, especially the behavioral approaches or behavioral therapist, or we can say behaviorist, they use the different learning principle in the different setting to deal with the different psychological issues. Using the learning as a basis of therapy soon get a very momentum in the 1950 onwards, and it can also be seen in the terms of Bandura social learning theory, which was developed in 1977 or 1962, which is provided that the momentum much when needed, when that is empirically provoking sociological variable that impact learning. So, this is something through which we can briefly understand the emergence of behavioral therapy or emergence of behavioral approaches in the therapy, we can say in other words. So, learner, let's talk about certain assumptions of behavior therapy, because every therapy has certain assumptions. We need to know these assumptions very carefully, and once we know about the assumptions, we would be more comfortable to use this therapy in the different setting. So, what are the assumptions of behavior therapy? Let us discuss about it. So, behavior is a result of external even environment and internal cognition and other mental processes such as attitude and belief. So, we know about it that the behavior is a kind of a result which comes from the external environment, internal cognition, and other mental processes also play a major role, like attitude and other things, which also produce make an important role to produce behavior. Using learning theory are a very valid method to even bring about a significant and lasting psychological changes, which are the very important assumptions that the behavioral approaches talks about, where they think like the learning theories are very important things through which we can use as a method to bring about the significant and last changing in the psychological changes that we want. So, the theories of learning may be used or can be used effectively for the therapeutic purposes. So, the client play here a very active role in when decreasing his or her psychological distress by learning new ways to coping and as well as to self management. So, there are two things that the client does here. One is the client play a very active role to first how to decrease those behavior which are as a kind of psychological distress by learning new ways and coping with the self management skills which can be the part of this therapy as well. So, effectiveness of therapy is something which is measurable using empirical method, that is impact of the therapy on the client can be also measured using the standardized psychological tools. So, these are the assumptions which we can say that the behavior therapy has, in which they claim that whatever the changes take place in the client's behavior, which can be easily measured and which can empirically observed and can we validate whether the changes has been taken place or not with the help of different psychological tools. So, success of therapy is marked by the translation of therapeutic goals to the real life situation. So, not just the producing them during a session or having a knowledge and insight regarding them, but also it should be reflect in the real life situation. If the situation is not very normal, or we can say whatever the learning take place within the therapeutic session is not reflecting in the real life, then there is no way of applying all the behavioral therapy. So, this is the kind of assumptions we usually talk about. The therapeutic goal can be only be reached if the client is self-efficacy. That is the faith that the change is possible, and that is the he or she is capable to bringing about that changes. So, the first thing that the client should have the self-efficacy and the faith that the change is possible. If the client is believing that the change is not possible, then the behavioral therapy would not be that much effective. So, the first the client should be realized in the position where they can realize that the change is possible and they have the belief that it is possible, and he or she is capable to bring those changes in their life, in their behavior. So the psychological elements are not disorder, but the problem in living, it's a major things that we should concentrate on it. So, therapeutic intervention and the technique are not universal and must be tailored to the need for each client and their presenting problem. So, it is not universal that one thing that can apply to all the client universally, but it is different upon the nature of the client and the problem of the client and how the client is actively involved the things. Accordingly, the therapy can be slightly modified. Let us talk about the goal of behavioral therapy. In the goal of behavioral therapy, it is very similar as we see the goal of other therapy. The similarity in terms of the other counselor also want to help the client to make a good adjustment to the life circumstances and achieve the personal and professional objective in their life. So, this is something which is very common in other therapy as well. But in the behavioral therapy also focuses upon the modifying and eliminating the maladaptive behavior. So, whatever the maladaptive behavior which has been identified during the session, which should be modified, which may be modify or eliminate. So, only the elimination is not enough, but unproductive action must be replaced with the productive way of responding. So, how the client is responding in the different situation which is unproductive in nature should be replaced with the productive. Only the elimination is not enough to deal with the different situations that the client is facing in their life, but it should be replaced with the productive way. The goal is to focus on reinforcing and fostering those behavior which are positive in nature. So, the goal is to reinforce the client's behavior which are positive in nature and eliminate unwanted or maladaptive behavior which is not required in their life and which can be considered as a part of trouble or the cause of problem. So, those maladaptive behavior, unwanted behavior should be eliminated first and to reinforce those behavior which are positive in nature that can help the client to cope effectively in their personal or professional or occupational life. To change or eliminate a specific behavior is a very important goal of the behavioral therapy, and the behavioral therapy also focuses upon increasing the person's engagement in the positive or social reinforcing activities, which is more in nature that how the person can involve themselves in those positive activity which ultimately help them to be very effective in the coping with the different situations and deal with their and achieve their objectives in their personal and professional life. Learner, we are going to talk about a very important things here in this segment, which is related with the theoretical background of behavioral therapy. So, behavioral therapy nothing but based upon the certain learning principle, as we have discussed in detail in the just before. So, here we need to understand what are the theoretical background which is there in the therapy, which actually use in the therapeutic techniques. The first things that you need to know here, which is classical conditioning. You well aware about it, like classical conditioning is given by Evan Pavlov. The classical conditioning is conditioning where, or associative learning that we generally talk about it, where the pairs of natural stimulus is paired with the neutral stimulus. So, when the two stimulus associate with each other, one is the natural stimulus, another one is the neutral stimulus, then there is a chances that once the association take place, that the neutral stimulus elicit the same response that we see in the natural stimulus. So, for example, let me take one example here. In the classical conditioning, suppose the neutral stimuli is like for instance is the rattlesnake. Which naturally elicit the kind of fear. Whenever we see any snake, we can have a kind of fear. When these kind of natural stimuli is associated with the neutral stimuli, like only the sound of a rattling noise, or maybe the noise of something else which is neutral in nature, which cannot elicit the same fear response. But when these two stimulus, like stimulus or natural stimulus is associated with the neutral stimulus, then the conditioning take place. It required a repetitive practices, and once it is going with the repetitive way, it can be the possibility is there in the classical conditioning that the neutral stimulus can elicit the response of natural stimulus. So, here we can see that the eliciting of fear is happening not because of the natural stimulus, which is a rattlesnake, but it is because of the noise. So, the noise which is not having any efficiency to elicit the fear response, but it is happening because of the conditioning. Okay, let us learner talk about operant conditioning, which is also one of the theory which has been given by Skinner, and this theory is nothing but it is also another type of associative learning theory, where we see that how people learn something because of the association. So, this is the model of learning that focuses on the rewarding of the individual for displaying the desirable behavior and penalizing them for the displaying undesirable ones. So, whatever the behavior that we want to repeat in the future, we give them reward, where we penalize them or we give them a punishment which for those behavior which we do not want to pursue, to want to continue in their life. So, this operant conditioning is basically a word itself enough to understand that how do we operate the behavior with the help of consequences. So, behavior is nothing but it is regulate with its consequences. So, here the learning is achieved through the reinforcement and punishment. So, reinforcement works to increase the desirable behavior, where the punishment works to decrease the undesirable behavior. For undesirable behavior, what we do? We try to decrease them from the behavior, and we try to increase the desirable behavior, and how we can do it with the reinforcement. So, let me talk very clearly about two major concepts, which is called reinforcement and punishment. Further, reinforcement and punishment is divided into two parts. One is called positive reinforcement, another one is called negative reinforcement. Similarly, we have a positive punishment and negative punishment. So, in these conditions, we need to understand here what is positive and negative reinforcement. Suppose when we add something which is pleasurable things to reward to the individual, that can be placed as a positive reinforcement. And when we remove something which is displacing or to the reward, which is also a kind of reward, but we are keeping out of the situation, then it comes under the negative reinforcement. In the reinforcement, most of the time we give reward, so which is something which is not pleasurable for the individual. We are keeping away from those unpleasurable things, can be considered as a negative reinforcement, which comes under the negative reinforcement. Similarly, for punishment, we add something which is displeasure or spilling for the individuals, and which is not very liking for the individual. Any punishment can be the positive punishment example. So, in the negative things, we are eliminating something which is pleasurable for the individual, and we are eliminating from their life which is come under the punishment, which is negative in nature. So, let me briefly talk about these things once again. So, those things which are pleasurable and we add, which comes under the positive reinforcement, which is unpleasurable we are eliminating, which is comes under the negative reinforcement. The unpleasurable thing we are adding, which is comes under the positive punishment, and which is pleasurable things we are eliminating from the individual life, which is called negative punishment. So with this we can understand the role of punishment in the operant conditioning and how individual conditions with the behavior with the help of reinforcement and punishment. Another learning theory which is very important here we would like to mention here, which is called social learning theory. As opposed to the prevailing notion that the time, the Albert Bandura is highlighted the importance of the personal variables and the observation of learning. So, observational learning is also one of the means through which we learn, means by observing, by imitating the things we also learn something. So, while he agreed that the classical and operant conditioning were important mode of learning, he laid emphasis on the cognitive mediation process, that is the role of thoughts, attitude, value in the learning. Although the stimulus response association is also there, he addressed those things. He actually agreed with all the operant and classical conditioning theory, but he also added one important things during the learning process, which is thoughts, attitude and values. So, he also brought the light the learning that occurs in the human just by virtue of being present in the certain environment, and through the process like imitation and modeling, and term it is observational learning. So, imitation and the observation and repeating the same behavior of the individuals, we can see how do we repeat the same behavior by observing the other person, which comes under the social learning or observational learning, which has been laid down by Albert Bandura. So, Bandura has worked a lot in these segments, which is also a very important thing that we use in the behavioral therapy approach. So, these three things, classical conditioning, then operant conditioning and the social learning or observational learning, are the three major background of the behavioral therapy. So, before going to the actual what techniques that we apply in the behavioral therapy, let me talk about the role of therapist in the therapy, how the counselor play a role in the behavioral therapy. So, the therapist role is that like a teacher and like a model during the therapy. So, the teacher and model, how they do, whatever the things they display, the other students try to imitate them. So, similarly, the therapist play a role like a teacher or like a model in the therapeutic session. So, the therapist, or we can say the counselor, has a job to entail information collection, designing the intervention and continually subjecting the outcomes of the therapy to empirically validation. So, empirically validation is also one of the things that you can find in the therapy, because behavioral approaches talks about empirical evidences that can be tested further. So, this is the things that through which we can understand that the process of information collection would require the therapist to ask for the presenting problems, clarifying them, synthesize an outcome behavior with the client, which would have presenting problems and create a therapy that would lead to the outcome of behavior. So, therapist is also responsible for maintaining conditions favorable for the behavioral changes during the course of the therapy and the model ideal behavior for the client. So, this is the major role of the therapist in the behavioral therapy. Let me talk about role of client in the therapy. What is the role of client here in the therapy? The client is a aware participant in the therapeutic process. Here very active role that the client has to play. The client and the therapeutic in deciding what the outcome behavior should be, and the participants also think about the therapeutic work through the engagement, cooperation and self monitoring. All these things here we can see the client very actively participate. The client play a major role in as like a lot of student that we can find in the school classroom setting as well. The some student would be considered as a very alert student. Similarly, client here play a very role of alert student during the therapy and experiments with the variety of behavior responses, and this eventually allow the client to increase their behavioral ranges. So here the client has the opportunity to actively participate in the therapy, where the therapist and the client can actively involve themselves and to work with each other in the different goal settings and to discuss things about it. So learner, we have just discussed about the role of therapist and role of client in the behavioral therapy. Let me discuss very briefly about relationship between the client and counselor. What should be relationship between the client and counselor in the behavioral therapy? While behaviorists understand the appeal that warmth and empathy is in the therapy, they do not consider these attributes sufficient for the change. So only the warmth and the empathy is not sufficient, that is not that much sufficient to attribute in the in terms of the changes. So Lazarus in 1989 considered that the client's respect towards the therapist as the essential component of the therapeutic relationship, as it allows the client to the trust the professional and engage in the self disclosure, both of which is invaluable for the therapy to translate into the long lasting behavioral outcomes. So the therapist and the counselor both should be engaged in such a way where the client has a proper faith and trust on the therapist that he or she can help me a lot to change my behavior, which is maladaptive in nature, and to come up with the productive behavior. So the client should have a proper trust on the counselor, or we can say there is a trust relationship between both of them. Ultimately, the client is nothing but it's an active person in the therapy. Here we can see that the behaviorist views is a counselor as a problem solver who direct the client towards the displaying more adaptive behavior and to come up with those behavior which is productive in nature for the client. And client here play an important role to change their behavior in their life with the proper involvement in the therapy. So with this, I would like to summarize this session, that in this session we have discussed about what behavioral therapy is all about, what are the theoretical background of the behavioral therapy, in which we discussed three major theories. One is the classical conditioning, second one is the operant conditioning, and third one is the social learning theory and observational learning we talked about. We have also seen the different role of therapist, client and their relationship in this session. In another session, we will talk about the different techniques of behavioral therapy and its role in the different settings. Thank you.